this. So I feel like every time I introduce a new event or topic or issue or disaster, I caveat it by saying that we've talked about this before, because modern society feels a lot like Groundhog Day, and I'd like to unsubscribe from this time period. Thank you. And today's topic is no exception. By now, most of you will be aware, to some degree, about the transgender athletes participating in women's sports and the total shirt show surrounding it. Shirt show. I'm gonna go with it. And if you haven't heard about this, I don't know what to tell ya. Read a book. But there are constant developments regarding fairness, equality, women's access to particular opportunities, many of which actually I talked about in my video about the erasure of women. I became acutely aware of this issue in early 2019 when I watched the Daily Signals video about several female high school runners feeling marginalized when two transgender athletes started competing against them.
It will be the end of girls and women's only sport if we make simply gender identity the basis for eligibility for girls.
Right, you'll have men's sports and you'll have co-ed sports.
It's giving the transgender females the right to compete with biological females, and eventually it's going to get to the point where the biological females will be on the sidelines watching their own sports.
It exposed the ways in which colleges and high schools were handling the explosion of transgender individuals across the United States in particular, and how it might affect sports across the board, leaving many to conclude that it was and still is female athletes who ultimately lose out against biological male competitors who still have biological and physiological advantages over their female counterparts. At the same time, many transgender athletes themselves and their supporters argue that no such advantage exists, and they should not be excluded from the sports they love because they were born in the wrong
Hi guys,
body.
this is Marriage or Bachelor Highlights, and today we are responding to a video how slowly the female sport is being suffocated to date. What is your thought on it? I do believe that since the third wave of women empowerment, everything have been put into confusion, and today the effect is being manifested in our face. The equality right for men and women is okay, but the third wave have destroyed many things about the differences between male and female, everything no more as equality. And you see what is happening in the female sport now. Every woman now is complaining about this. What is your thought on it? Share it down below. Let's continue watching the video.
And thus, the battle over what's fair has become a focal point. But seriously, when aren't we fighting over what's fair? Is anything ever fair? Not when you're this much of a bootlicker, it's not. With so many eyes on this issue, the question has become, will it ever be fair for biological men, no matter how they identify or how many hormones they've taken, to participate in women's sports? Which brings us to New Zealand's transgender weightlifter, Laurel Hubbard. You guys might want to strap in for this one. Those of you who have lives outside of politics and media can't relate. You might have missed the news that Hubbard is confirmed as the first transgender athlete to compete at the Olympic Games in Tokyo in July. Hubbard is 43, transitioned in 2013, and is in New Zealand's women's super heavyweight class. Why though? I'm not gonna lie, there's a couple jokes I could make here, but I'm feeling spicy. And they wouldn't be nice. So I'm just gonna leave it at this.
Holy shit, it's Bigfoot!
Now, no doubt the transgender lobby sees this as a great step towards inclusivity and equality for transgender athletes. In this case, you have an individual who is rising to arguably one of the most prestigious positions in sports, participating in the Olympics, for lifting up heavy things and putting them back down again. I once picked up something heavy. My hatred and disdain for men. However, in their haste to feel one way or another, it seems that people often forget about the women who are being pushed out of their own sports to accommodate this new social emphasis and shift. On social media, the image of a young female lifter started making the rounds, claiming that this is the woman who would have made it to her first Olympics were it not for Hubbard. While it certainly appears that way from documentation like this, I have to confess that I'm no expert at the selection process here, and I don't want to definitively make that claim. But regardless, the fact remains that if it isn't this 21-year-old weightlifter losing out, it is certainly someone else. People often forget that when it comes to sports, individuals train their whole lives to be good enough to qualify for these specific kinds of games. They work tirelessly to even be considered. I think most of us who've cared about anything deeply can at least understand on some level the pain that these athletes will be feeling having these opportunities ripped out from under them. Not because they're not good enough, but because they're competing against people who have arguably physiological advantages that they simply will never have. This is how some female athletes have described their feelings towards this topic, and towards Hubbard as a primary example. In saying this, I realize it's also quite difficult to conceptualize just how different men and women operate when it comes to individual sports like weightlifting. For anyone with a man in their life, just think about what it looks like when he opens jars for you, because sometimes they're really tough, or changes your tires, or does literally any other physical thing for you because your little itty bitty twig arms are useless. Yeah, I think that only applies to you. So let's take a look at a tweet thread that I think exemplifies this pretty well. Hubbard first debuted in the female category in 2017 and posted a new world record in the W35 super heavyweight category at the IWF Masters that same year. For this performance, Hubbard was named the best lifter in the entire female competition, all ages and weight categories. Her lift total of 280 kilograms absolutely smashed her category competitors. It wouldn't have been out of place in the corresponding male category. In fact, Hubbard's 2017 lift was entirely routine over the 10 years of male competition, and a huge outlier in the female competition over the same 10 years. For those asking, this first incomplete part of the story shows how, controlled for age, Hubbard is lifting well outside the female range. The second part is, of course, that Hubbard has earned an Olympic spot despite her advanced age. The same writer of these tweets, who is also coincidentally a developmental biologist, also noted that, at 43, the chances of a female appearing in super heavyweight Olympic weightlifting 1 in 308,000. Hubbard is 3 times more likely to be struck by lightning than a 43-year-old female is to appear in this event. Yeah, I'm fairly certain that we used to be more likely to be struck by lightning than be subjected to a lot of things. But then the world lost its frickin' mind. And now being a tree is a gender. Won't lie, it's a really great time for my mothership to come collect me right now. Anyway, this is why I personally believe that Hubbard is the perfect example of why this question of fairness is actually very easily answered. Let's take, for example, Tracy Lambrecht, a super heavyweight competitor who, during the Commonwealth Games, was asked to make way for Hubbard. When I was told to drop the category because Laurel was obviously going to be their #1 super, it was heartbreaking, like super soul-destroying. Or for Geiger Stowers, a woman who began lifting to cope with surviving sexual abuse, who won a gold medal at the 2018 Commonwealth Games because Hubbard was ineligible to participate due to injury. Probably not surprising to too many people, but the following year, Hubbard beat Stowers at the Pacific Games, taking gold while she took silver. These few examples illustrate how quickly the issue of fairness becomes apparent due to the participation of a single biologically male athlete in a women's category. It's important to remember that female athletes testify that this male presence impacts them in many areas, such as anxiety surrounding why they should even bother, all the way up to the loss of a higher placement or achievement that they otherwise might have had. And this isn't just about athletic performance in and of itself. Of course, that's a huge part of this, but let's consider our inability to even talk about this logically. Weightlifters have allegedly been told to keep quiet about Hubbard, for example, and have had to accept that there is nothing that they can do. So we take opportunities away from women, crush them at their own sports, and then deny them the ability to talk about it. I present to you the modern radical left, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, the other part of me is over here thinking, where are all the feminists?
First time ever any...
Part of the problem here too, and I've said this before, is that it feels like there's really nothing in place to safeguard female athletes. And while some might argue that there is in fact plenty of regulation, it really doesn't feel like there is. Several other transgender women athletes have begun competing against biological women. Many have previously competed against men in the past, and some of whom have aged out of the male category. Valentina Petrillo, and also just side note guys, there's a lot of complicated names that I have to say here, and I'm not that clever, so don't tease me in the comments. And if you do, only say really funny stuff, because them's the rules. Anyway, This is an example of someone who, according to the BBC, is now 47 and recognizes that this is her last chance to compete in the Paralympics, being that Pritchillo is blind. In fact, it was only last September that she ran her first official race as a female para-athlete at the Italian Paralympic Championship, where she won gold in the 100 meter, 200 meter, and 400 meter events. Considering all of this, some outlets also claim that Pritchillo is still listed as male on identification, which kind of gives me Zuby energy. I'm not gonna lie. You know, for those of you who aren't familiar, the guy who identified as a woman and then promptly beat the women's deadlift record and then went back to identifying as a man. Yeah, him. This conversation will inevitably always bring us back around to the discussion about the biological differences between men and women, which definitely exist. Don't let the libs tell you otherwise. I don't see any men over here trying to squeeze out watermelon-sized meat bags from their nether regions. Wow, Sydney. Thank you. That is a pleasant image. How can you squeeze a watermelon out of the nether region? It's in Europe. On one hand, there are transgender advocates and researchers who argue that there is no significant difference between biological women and transgender women after a year or several years on hormones. Or at least there is not enough of a significant difference for it to make an impact on equality and fairness. This, in part, may have been informed by the 2015 decision by the International Olympic Committee, also known as the IOC, to allow transgender athletes to compete as a woman if their testosterone levels are below a certain threshold. Although in further reading, I have read that that level is still actually higher than biological women's testosterone levels. Whether or not that's actually the case, I'm not entirely sure. It's also worth noting that allegedly males are allowed to compete in female events without undergoing surgery to remove their testes. On the other hand, of course, there are those who argue that there are significant differences between biological women and transgender women. A 2019 paper called Trans Women in Elite Sport: Scientific and Ethical Considerations looked at the IOC guidelines and determined that they are exceedingly unfair to female athletes. The researchers explain many physiological differences between men and women. For example, they reference how women have a wider pelvis, which leads to decreased joint rotation and muscle recruitment and ultimately makes us slower. We're slower, huh? This might help explain my disdain for running, or why I could never actually outrun my brother as a child and would always end up eating dirt. So many younger sisters can totally relate to what I'm saying right now. Trying to outrun your older brother never worked. Like 100% of the time, that never worked. This study also explains how the IOC's and many trans advocates' assumption that hormone replacement for at least a year mitigates any advantage a biological male might have is mostly false. They explain that transgender athletes will retain at least some physiological parameters that underpin athletic performance. This, coupled with the fact that trans women athletes are allowed to compete with more than 5 times the testosterone level of a cis woman, suggests that trans women have a performance advantage. And this conclusion is more or less backed up by other research. For example, 2 more peer-reviewed papers on the matter mostly conclude the same thing. One says that even after changes to hormone levels in the body, findings suggest that strength may well be preserved in trans women during the first 3 years of hormone therapy. The other concludes that longitudinal studies examining the effects of testosterone suppression on muscle mass and strength in transgender women consistently show very modest changes, where the loss of lean body mass, muscle area, and strength typically amount to approximately 5% after 12 months of treatment. Thus, the muscular advantage enjoyed by transgender women is only minimally reduced when testosterone is suppressed. So yeah, I guess that kind of explains why transgender MMA fighters pulverize their female opponents. Violence against women at the hands of men, that's a big no-no. Unless, of course, you're taking hormones, in which case, then it's okay. I guess my question here is, if we know a little bit about this topic, but we don't know enough and more research needs to be done, then why are we using female sports as the test arena? We have these endless conversations about what's fair while simultaneously and really sadly, actually, if we're being honest about it, completely overlooking the needs of female
Okay,
athletes.
guys, I will put the link down below for this video so you can complete the video down below. But I want you to share your thoughts down below also. Do you really believe that this is something like transgender or it's just the misconception in our mind? In my mind, I'm thinking that we are made male and female, and this issue of transgender is just something maybe it's a mental issue or is it real? I don't know. Just share your thought down below. I don't know. Just share it. I've tried to find out this thing. Why do people do this thing? Why do people act this way? I don't know. Share your thought down below. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.